And so next week, we'll be wrapping things up in terms of these formal meetings. And I'll have more specific instructions on how we're going to wrap it up in terms of final papers or projects, tests, that kind of stuff that will greet you in that last week for you to show me your learning and your insights for the semester. So, any questions as we get started here today? We're all okay? All right, well, I will go into the sharing portion here then. And yeah, here we go. Just to begin with here, wanted to make sure you're aware of the many, many, many opportunities that keep arising, and I keep plugging them into the course site, the Blackboard site, to make sure that you have easy access to this kind of thing. I'm sure you don't sit around it in the evening like twiddling your thumbs, wondering how to fill the night. But I wanted to make sure that this information is in front of you, so that as you find certain corners of the profession and practice that are of interest to you, or you see just a new idea that is inspiring, you can hopefully avail yourself of these different kinds of presentations. And you can see that they are coming at us from all around the world, which is very exciting, and a very different subject matter from looking at the missing middle of the housing market. So not, the middle part, not the elites, and not housing for the impoverished, resiliency design, and this initiative by the Fay Jones School of Architecture in Arkansas is pretty interesting, because they are basically asking their faculty to dig really deep into their research and put together 30 great minutes of what they're working on. So it's a really snappy, short presentation of brand new research. And then there's, looking down the list a little bit farther, a more historical topic, Christopher Wren, his churches, and focusing on the local craftsmen that he relied on to do the stone and wood carving in those churches. And that's a scholar from Oxford University in England, of course, that will be giving that presentation. And then there's a presentation at the end by two architects sort of talking about their development of practices and their firms. In the middle, there you can see in red highlighted, is the initial meeting for the inaugural Habitat for Humanity student chapter here at Belmont. And as you heard last week, that's something that's going to begin as a partnership between the O'Moore and Watkins colleges. And it would be fantastic to see you there in that meeting if you have an interest. Again, this is an introductory meeting, one to kind of lay the groundwork. As you can imagine, there's paperwork that needs to be filed with the university to get this thing off the ground. And you'll learn about the very many different opportunities to engage with that group. So there is some stuff coming at you. So any comments, questions there? Shall we move on? We can move on, indeed. So we're looking at adaptive reuse for the first part of class today as one of the aspects of sustainability and something that touches just about every architect's practice. I don't know anybody who does solely brand new work and has never done anything as an addition or a refurbishment of an older structure. I imagine they're out there. I don't know any people like that though. And it's also then, not exactly the, I'm trying to think of the other end of the spectrum. I do know a couple people in historic preservation whose jobs are absolutely taking care of old buildings and doing all they can to not introduce new stuff into those old buildings. So we've got these two ends of this spectrum, right? Brand new construction, all new from the foundation up. And then on the other end, preservation of stuff that is already there and not changing anything about it as much as possible. So in the middle then, we've got this really broad kind of practice that we call adaptive reuse. So before we get started here, who would like to define what this means? What has been your takeaway given the information you've looked at this week? What is adaptive reuse? Ryan?
A sustainable building that is one you can recycle or adapt to change.
Say that again?
A sustainable building is one that you can recycle or adapt to change.
Okay, so an adaptive reuse project then would be what? How would you define that in your own words?
Basically, the building is modular. It can be changed with the time.
Okay, I'm thinking we have the building as a module that can be changed with the times. All right?
Yeah, and also it can give more to the environment than takes away.
Okay. Okay, that's possible that it can give more to the environment that it takes away. Nathan, what do you have?
I was going to say that adaptive reuse is the act of modifying an existing building, usually historical, so that it's not only preserved but can serve a function in modern society, and also be hopefully like a positive additive to the environment it exists in regards to sustainability, but at the very least, it should have less of an environmental impact as a result of being renovated.
Okay, so less of an environmental impact because you're already using some material that's there.
Right.
And you use the word historic. What do you mean by that?
So like any building that has historic or cultural significance within the, the society in which it exists. So like maybe like, okay, so in that video that you showed on your website, a great example was the dock houses where they used to levy port fees. And obviously the system has changed since then. So the initial purpose of the structure is obsolete, but that doesn't mean that the structure itself is obsolete. So it was repurposed for hotel rooms. So that could be a historic building, like maybe an old factory that used to be an economic hub of a building could be, or sorry, of a city could be a historic building, like an old church, anything that could stand to be repurposed to have function in modern society.
Great. So a shell of a thing that has some kind of significance to a place. And this is an interesting idea to kind of parse out and think about, what makes a building important historically or otherwise? Because this is one of the things I think we might see as a separation between buildings that get historic preservation attention and those that are adaptively reused. So when you think about adaptive reuse in its relationship with historic preservation, how do you think those two things differ, or what have you seen so far that you think are kind of the distinctions between those two realms? Yeah, Kate?
It seems like adaptive reuse gives the building at least not really related to its original use, whereas historic preservation preserves the building for what it was made to do.
Okay, so historic preservation maintains the original use of the building, whereas adaptive reuse is going to change it. And this kind of ties into what Nathan said about I think you used the word obsolete. That something about the original building is just not useful anymore for one of who knows how many reasons. So the historically preserved building is one whose function, I guess you could maybe another distinction that we see sometimes is when the function is still present and being continually used, or it's a function that is seen as being historically significant somehow. So people want to go like see the setting where famous things happened, like Independence Hall in Philadelphia, right? It is no longer used as a government center, but people want to go see that building. It's historically preserved because it's seen as this great emblem of American democracy, right? So I think, this gives you a lot of different ideas for how buildings fall in a continuum. And yeah, those projects in Holland are really interesting ones because you can see those little industrial buildings as being significant because they help to build the economy of the place. Power stations, likewise, they keep showing up in these venues for adaptive reuse. But not the same kind of thing as you would say, like, the reason that we preserve George Washington's house, for example, right? But they do have importance within their cities, within their settings. And I hope that's something that you all found with the individual projects that you have been working on too. So any other questions or comments on those those main issues. I wanted to make sure that we are all sort of, you're working with similar definitions before we get started here. Alrighty. So I've got a slideshow put together to look at some adaptive reuse projects and also to remind us that this is nothing new at all. And in fact, many of the buildings that are sort of great, amazing landmarks that are still standing for us to look at and study and appreciate and travel to when we're allowed to travel, still survive, have been continuously maintained or near to continuously maintained because they were the objects of adaptive reuse. So I've given you at the bottom of the screen here the contemporary names of these buildings that you might know by other names. So Santa Maria della Rotonda, this Christian church where if you could fly to Rome this weekend, you can go to a service there. That of course is the Pantheon, designed for worship of the Roman gods back in the time of Hadrian. Here at the bottom, Santa Maria degli Angeli. This is another Christian church, as you might have picked up, in Rome. This is an adaptive reuse project by Michelangelo. This is actually one of the halls of the Baths of Diocletian, again, coming from Imperial Rome. And then on the right, Hagia Sophia Jami, the mosque named Hagia Sophia, takes its name from the Christian church. Indeed, this was built as not just any old Christian church, but the central cathedral for the capital of the Byzantine Empire. So built for Christian worship, transferred into use as a mosque in the 15th century. So all of these buildings then were turned into different use because they were flexible, but also because people wanted them to be flexible, right? That's part of the story here, that people, architects, builders had created these structures, these monuments, these giant chunks of urban furniture that were seen as aesthetically pleasing, as culturally valuable, and people wanted to keep using them. So that is, one of the aspects of adaptive reuse that's good to keep in mind. And I think there's a quote that comes up a little bit later by Norman Foster, who says, the thing is, as an architect, you want to be sure that you design for the unknown use, the thing that's going to happen in the future that you don't know. Something's going to make the function of the building you're designing today obsolete, and you want people to hang on to that building. So it needs to be flexible, but then it also needs to be something that people want to save, right? Because not every building is preserved and reused in this way. Two more examples. The Flavian Amphitheater, which you know better as the Colosseum, while it was dismantled and used as a quarry during the Renaissance, the arches are so thick here in the exterior of the building that in the Middle Ages, these were actually walled on either side by timber, and families would build whole apartments within these little spaces. So it's a very kind of grassroots, urban guerrilla kind of adaptive reuse, but I think it counts. And on the bottom, this is a rebuilt building. It's a Hellenistic Greek structure called a stoa. The Greeks used this as a nice covered place with a lot of shade to get out from away from the sun. And then behind these columns and behind the kind of pathway that's covered and has all the shade, there's individual little offices or little shops, really, is the way this would work as kind of a closed market space. So the building was in ruins in the early 20th century, was rebuilt as closely as possible to the Hellenistic model. So we're going back to like the 4th century BCE. And it's now the offices for the archaeological foundation in Athens. So again, it's been used in a similar way to its original function, but in part, again, because some human activities don't really go away and can be easily housed within historic structures, as we see here. So where this comes from, something I've entitled the spirit of preservation, the fact that people like to hang on to old buildings for a lot of different reasons. And in this country, I think that what we see is, if you go through and did a whole study on adaptive reuse through time and space, one of the things that you'll see time and again is that this really begins to pick up in the 1960s. And that's because the preservation movement began really popular in the 1960s. What you're looking at here is a kind of condemning message, an editorial in the New York Times about the demolition of Penn Station, which we'll look at in just a moment. A massive stone building, but also with some pretty interesting new steel technology in it also. That was a real palace for train travel. But it was demolished to make room for something else, something you might know. And you see what this writer has said is, any city gets what it admires, will pay for, and ultimately deserves. And I think that's a really interesting thing to keep in mind, because as future architects, you have it in your power to give people something that they will admire, provide that for them, so they'll want to pay for it. And ideally then, of course, we're a society that deserves good buildings too. We will probably be judged not by the monuments we build, but by those we have destroyed. So you see this editorial was very much in the mindset of encouraging preservation and reuse of existing structures. So this is the mid-century modern exemplar, Madison Square Garden, a new international landmark. As you can see, it's being advertised here at the time of its design. There it is, a building that is not much beloved aesthetically or really anything. It doesn't help that, of course, the environment here is pretty congested and intense in not a great way. So this is the building that replaced that building. So with the original architects, McKim, Mead, and White, who were probably the largest architecture firm in the country in the early part of the 20th century, what they designed was a real palace for people to arrive in and depart from the city. Their idea was that train travel was an elegant way to see the country. And so they had a building that was really a pretty fantastic monument to the modernity of travel and the fact that people had such, had leisure and business and were moving around the country. It was a very exciting building because of what it represented. So here on the left, you can see the waiting room for people, the stone hall with its great arches and humongous columns. You can see people down here for scale. And then the sort of the shape and form of the masonry here is emulated in the train shed itself. And so that's what you see as the steel structure where the trains would pull in. So the building really was a pretty spectacular thing. But it is true that by the middle of the 20th century, with the rise of the automobile, fewer and fewer people were going anywhere by train. And so that's why the decision was made that, this thing is obsolete and we need a place for concerts and basketball games. So knock this thing down and build the new thing. And that is the way it went. And more than any other of the great building demolitions that happened here in the middle of the 20th century, and a lot of them were happening. This is also a time of slum clearance, so-called slum clearance in cities like Chicago and New York, to be sure, Detroit, Philadelphia, elsewhere. So it's a time of reassessing what is modern, what is useful, what is functional, and an initial feeling that these old buildings can't provide any service for us. It brought out the people of New York in droves to picket and protest against the loss of this building, and really did inspire a new broadening and popularity of historic preservation across the country. It wasn't the first time people took notice of things being torn down and needing some protections, though. And this is just a quick timeline that gives you a number of important steps in the development of historic preservation here in the United States. And most people come back here to 1853 for really the first great initiative by any group of Americans to save something. And it's a group who called themselves the Mount Vernon's Ladies Association. And they were there to save, indeed, George Washington's house. And you can see that, where these preservation movements picked up, tended to focus around sites of really important American history. So Mount Vernon, all kinds of places in New England where, you know, the Pilgrims settled and built their cities, Williamsburg in Virginia, etc. By the 1960s, Independence Mall in Philadelphia. And I'll also then draw your attention here just to the 1960s, this, and then into the 70s, this chunk of time, again, that is the same time that Penn Station was demolished. There it is right in the middle. You can see very soon thereafter, New York City founds its Landmarks Preservation Commission and starts to enact laws and protections for historic structures. And what's an interesting part of that law, I think, is that they say we have to protect these things because it's for the common good. It's for the welfare of people, health and welfare. Old buildings are seen as contributing to those civic virtues. And to put their money where their mouth is, the federal government comes through by the 1970s and puts into place a bunch of tax credits and reform acts. And this is the kind of thing that you'll be learning about in a couple years. It's really smart to know these things because if you take care of old structures in certain ways, you can do great financial things for your clients. That is a little beyond what we need to look at today. I just want to kind of plant that seed and you'll get back to it another time. But the real takeaway here is that it's a national movement. Local and federal governments come to the cause of preserving buildings because they think it's good for people, good for cities. So again, there is Mount Vernon, the way the Ladies Association found it and bought it. And there it is in a recent photograph. So pristine and returned to as closely as possible the way it looked as George Washington walked through these halls. Now, at this point, you might say, well, that's a really interesting niche practice, right? The idea of historic preservation. We take care of the structures and houses and governing halls of the powerful men who built this country. And that indeed is what preservation was like in its first decades. Again, as of the 70s into the 80s, this field begins to broaden, has become much more dynamic and responsive to social initiatives. And recognizing that having like a, you know, this pristine president's house in a beautiful landscape, it tells a story, but it's not the whole story. So there's a greater emphasis made to bring the whole environment together, again, to tell the full historic story. So on the inside, you have these fantastically detailed interiors, painstaking efforts to get exactly the right color of teal that George Washington liked. But then also, you can see this 16-sided barn was reconstructed in just the last few years. This was actually also a design by George Washington. And what's doing is returning the idea of an agricultural processes on the estate of Mount Vernon. And of course, this didn't happen with a lot of human power. So the landscapes of enslaved people as well are being rebuilt and interpreted and make sure, again, the fullness of that story is put together here in Mount Vernon as one example. You had a question, Ryan?
How do you know what actually was Washington? Like, is it like?
Oh, like how they find the paint?
Yeah.
Usually in an example like this, there's been a lot of layers, and the easiest way to do it is to simply start using sandpaper. You kind of do a big one, a big piece, a big area on the wall, and get smaller and smaller and smaller. The idea is you're kind of making a funnel down to the wood. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so either that or now more likely it's a microscopic chipping coming out of there. So lots of different ways. And that is, one of the many reasons that historic preservation is really hard and requires advanced study at the master's level. Further, in terms of the dynamic nature of this field, again, it began with the idea that we need to preserve all this colonial history and heritage, and that's all great. But when as the profession begins to age and the professionals begin to age too, they recognize that the more recent past is worthy of being preserved as well. So 2 examples from the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, the 17th century Boardman House up here. Great salt box type of colonial building, but also Walter Gropius's house. Walter Gropius is the director and founder of the Bauhaus in Germany. And when he immigrated to the United States, he built this house. And so it is preserved as a part of celebrating his legacy here in the United States. The dynamic quality of modernism, though, and changing these definitions of what is history and what's valuable, what's worthy of our study, comes into some interesting practical quandaries when we look at modernist architecture like Crown Hall here, the architecture building for IIT in Chicago. Because this building was, like Gropius's building, was constructed to be at the forefront of technology and kind of with a futurist idea that buildings should become obsolete and die and be replaced. So they weren't building like George Washington was. You know, George Washington would be real glad that his house is still standing and say, yeah, that's what I was hoping for. Walter Gropius more likely to say, I thought you'd be done with that already and have replaced it. So there's some interesting challenges that arise with buildings like this 1950s Mies van der Rohe building, which has been restored in the last 5 years. And just for examples of two kinds of things that they had to deal with. You know, Mies's architecture is minimalist, to be sure. It's basically a steel structure with basically 4 big legs on the long sides of the building, a glass curtain wall, and because there's sun, these big levolor blinds on the inside. And there, of course, is Mies himself. If you're looking at George Washington's house and there's some rot in the wood, preservationists are sweating bullets to figure out how to preserve that piece of wood, right? There's not the sense that you're just going to take that out and replace it with something else. Certainly nothing brand new, right? You're not going to replace that with Dryvit because that would be easy. But the question with this architecture that of course is about inventiveness raises the question, should you specify new materials that Mies van der Rohe would be enjoying right now today? What do you do? Because the blinds, for example, over here, were deemed obsolete. They were no longer in production. They're big fat blinds. So do they ask Levolor to go back and make the big fat blinds because that's part of the aesthetic? Ultimately, they decided yes. And so the new blinds that hang in Crown Hall are some of the most expensive blinds ever because a whole factory had to be put back online just to do the blinds for this one single building. The glass, however, even though the glass is different from 1950 than it was here in 2010, this was deemed something that was expendable. And because some things had been broken, they decided to take all the glass out and replace all of it with a more energy efficient glazing system. And so what they did in a very smart move was they auctioned off panes of glasses as a fundraiser. So you could bid like $10,000 and have the joy of swinging a hammer through a Mies van der Rohe wall.
What if they actually want to keep the thing going?
What's that?
Okay.
Yes. It's really hard to match the color because glass really isn't colorless. So it's a very tough thing with these buildings that are all about glass.
One question though, about the wood though.
Mm-hmm.
If they actually would, if they have to replace the wood for like a structure, make the structure structurally sound, would they do?
The question is, would they, if it was a matter of the building collapsing, would they replace the wood? And the answer is yes. With something as significant as a president's house, you'd think it wouldn't have gotten to that point. And there would already be remediations inside of the building.
Yeah, I'm just a little bit wondering, like, what would be considered, replaceable and what's not replaceable?
The question is what's replaceable and not replaceable. The purest historic preservationist, you preserve everything, absolutely everything you can. The only replace when something is beyond the pale or is damaging the structure itself. So it's a pretty high mark. One more note, again, just a note about the challenges of buildings that depend on their aesthetic for, or depend on structural and technological advance for their aesthetic, and then that technology goes bad. This is Unity Temple, Frank Lloyd Wright's great church in Oak Park, Illinois. And as is the case for Frank Lloyd Wright and other people who wanted to push the envelope, his detailing of concrete was not so good. But it's not all on him. Of course, this is a church that is not rolling in extra dough to throw at their building. So there's a lot of deferred maintenance on this building. And it was a, well, as you can see here, a super disaster with rebar showing here, massive spalling in the corners. So a preservation project was undertaken, a really, really long one, I would say upwards of 20 years, to fix everything that was falling apart with this building. But there it is on the left, and it is an amazing building, worth the effort for future generations to enjoy it. And you can see what you're looking at here are the 3 buildings that last year won the 2019 Richard Driehaus Preservation Awards as awarded by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. So this is a pretty elite group. So it's the Frank Lloyd Wright Church on the left, a bridge up here on the right in Boston. I'll check my notes. Yeah, the bridge is in Boston. And then this thing that's called South Street Landing right now is a powerhouse in Providence, Rhode Island. And so these are the buildings that got this elite award. And again, historic preservation for sure, right? Both the church and the bridge are still doing the same thing they were designed to do. This one takes us back into that other realm though, because this is no longer a power station. This is kind of a cultural center and hangout place. So you can see again how there's a continuum here of historic preservation and adaptive reuse. So the envelope of this building has been beautifully restored, lots of tuck pointing, care for that limestone, remediation to care for the steel structure on the inside, but then also a fair amount of repurposing of that interior to serve a new purpose. Now, the issue of facadism came up in the presentation across the week too. And there were some questions in the quiz about how this fits in. Facadism really is the most extreme use of adaptive reuse. But it's not something that very many people like. With facadism, what that means is literally you keep the facade and nothing else. So you can see in this construction photograph, the whole building is being demolished and a fair amount of steel structure is brought on to just hold up that exterior. And then a whole new thing is built in the back. And so a few more examples of sort of extremes of facadism. And so at this point, you can hardly really say it's adaptive reuse anymore, right? Because they're just using the front of the building as kind of a face, a veneer. And this is something that is largely, derided in the profession. I love this book. I mean, I don't think you could find a more British title than this, right? The Creeping Plague of Ghastly Facadism.
I actually kind of like the Castle one.
Do you?
Yeah, I really like that actually.
Well, it is a matter of taste, I suppose. For a lot of people looking at this, it is something that they saved the castle front. For others, they feel like this is a thin way to treat history, and why not preserve more of the building and again adapt it into something else, maybe put your glass box as an addition to serve more functions. But again, this is a matter of opinion.
It looks nice. It's like a combination of the past and present. Right.
That's okay.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. I will note one note I came across getting ready for class today. It was one writer who described facadism as urban taxidermy. And I thought, well, that's an interesting way to look at this. So adaptive reuse too, how else do we describe it? It's the original green. What does that mean? That is Norman Foster there on the left, someone who I don't normally associate with preservation and adaptive reuse because his incredibly gigantic firm is all about, as usually when I'm seeing them in the press, brand new extraordinary buildings. Like you see him here in the tippy top of the Gherkin or Pickle building that was in the Goldberger book a couple chapters ago. But indeed, he's someone who is a great storyteller in his architecture, that is sure. And I think that's something that even as he invests his very new architecture with stories, it's something he's drawing from kind of traditions of the past in that storytelling quality that architecture has. So he's the one, you've read words like this before, as ultimately sustainable building is one that you can recycle. So he's the one, again, that is kind of taking this into the future. You're recognizing that adaptive reuse is a good sustainable practice. And so when you are called upon to build something brand new, do it so that someone else can make something else of it. So long after you have died and the original function of that building is obsolete, somebody can do something else with it. But then also, of course, have the quality of building that people want to preserve. And so that accounts for things like the, well, I guess if we go through Vitruvius's ideas, right? The utilitas might be gone, so that's obsolete, you're replacing that. But you have to have those other two things still in place. So it's structurally sound, worth saving, just pragmatically. And then the venustas, so something beautiful or pleasing, culturally present about it, and thus worth hanging on to. So I thought we maybe would look at a couple examples of Foster's work. Here are two of his adaptive reuse projects. Again, this is kind of a matter of opinion, which one you think is more successful. Maybe you like them both, I don't know. The Murray Building on the left was constructed in 1969 in Hong Kong. It was an office building. And noted even at that early date, especially at that early date of 1969, for, you see how the windows are kind of slanty? That's to encourage sunlight to come deep into the building in winter and then be shaded or screened during the summer months. So it's an early overture towards environmental issues in a tall office building design. So that's this one, and it's now a hotel, and basically you can't tell at all, right, from the outside. There's virtually nothing visible that's happened on the exterior of this building. Whereas on the right, the Hearst Tower, this is the newspaper family. The original 6-story building down here comes from the 1910s, I want to say, 1928, excuse me. So 1928 building here, and the same corporation lives in this building, but simply have expanded their footprint and wanted more space, but on this same real estate. So you can see what Foster has done here is to build something extraordinarily different from the base of the building, right? There's just no confusing the time frame for these, right? When we look on the inside, again, here is the lobby of the hotel in Hong Kong, which is kind of a slick, modernist, simple, minimalist approach to the design that is contemporary, but is certainly in keeping with the aesthetic of that original building. Whereas on the right, Hearst Tower is super different, yes? So on the bottom here, you see in the section view, that is the original building. Only the walls are left. A new glass ceiling is put in place, or roof actually. And then the structure of the new building comes straight down into the interior lobby. So you can sit here and have your lunch at the base of these huge columns that support this massive, massive addition right on the top of the building. So technically both adaptive reuse projects, but a bit different at the same time. Certainly different in their handling. And again, I offer these very divergent views of adaptive reuse and kind of, architectural interventions to your consideration as you're forming your values. Do you like them?
Would the Hearst Tower be considered, façadism? Since it's just the walls?
You mean this one, the Hearst Tower?
Yes.
Would it be facadism? Maybe, because there's just really not that much left. It is indeed the whole thing. So is it facadism if you get all four walls? I don't know. I don't know if there's a master checklist for this kind of thing. I think it's a worthy critique. All right, so as we got a couple more views to look at here, a couple more examples of adaptive reuse at many different scales too. And I think this is, relates to some ideas we've had in class recently too, that, recognize that it's a rare project that allows you to just look at the building and not think about how you're tying into the systems of the city, how you relate to the sidewalk, how your building is going to cast shadows on your neighbor, and how you fit into the whole aesthetic and functional utility of a neighborhood or a city or settlement, et cetera. So it can be really, really comprehensive. This is Savannah, Georgia, as it was laid out in the early 18th century. Does anyone have an inclination where I might be going here? There's an institution well known in Savannah that has made is it SCAD? What does SCAD do? What do you know about SCAD? And do you know about their architecture? How would you describe their campus? Because this is indeed the Savannah College of Art and Design. Yeah, it is a huge grid. It's the city itself, right? SCAD was founded in 1978 when Savannah had fallen on hard times like so many other American cities. And historic structures had been emptying because, the department store went out of business, the movie theater went out of business, no new economic development was coming into town. And the people who founded SCAD saw a great opportunity because they could pick up historic structures for a song. And that's indeed what they've done. So you're looking at the plan of Savannah, and you can see in yellow all of the buildings that they have purchased, repurposed, and adaptively reused into the different functions of a college of design. So it's adaptive reuse at the whole scale of the city. So the department store here has now been turned into the library. The movie theater is called the Trustees Theater. It's basically, you can imagine a place where 600 or 700 people can fit together for giant lectures or big programs. And they've done a really impressive job of maintaining these buildings, restoring them, and then also, taking the cues of the original style of the building for the new interventions within them, as well as the signage on the outside of the building too. So you can just barely see here these very low Helvetica aluminum letters that spell out the name of the library, very much in keeping with the way the department store would have been advertised. Likewise, the marquee of the cinema has been replaced with the initials of the college. So a really clever, again, repurposing of these buildings that allowed this college to nestle thoroughly into the grid of the city, quite literally, in fact. And so this, goes back to a question from earlier in the class when I was asking, what is historic, what is worth saving? Again, we've come a long way from thinking it's just colonial buildings associated with the founding of the country and like major historic events that are worth saving. And preservationists will use terms like contributing. That is a main term they use. If a building contributes to its neighborhood, it's something that gets the attention of preservationists and adaptive reuse architects. And what do they mean by contributing? Well, usually it's something of a size, a scale that fits into a neighborhood. It's sort of human oriented, or it's something that has become kind of monumental in the landscape and embodies either values from the past that are seen worthy of preserving, sometimes aesthetic and material details that are simply no longer available. So even something as gritty as a power plant. This is what you're looking at here in London. Again, this is a building that was constructed for a really, brutal and not public function. But here on the left, you can see it has this really delicate Art Deco detailing in the brick that is no longer in production of quite this kind of quality. So there it is, the Bankside Power Plant. As it sat empty for decades, but it was just so big and hard to knock down, first of all. And also, even though this is really close to the center of London, but just on the south side, there's not a lot of development going on here until they begin this project. The government infused millions and millions of pounds, I guess not dollars, but pounds, into expanding the National Museum group. So there were, I think, 3 Tate galleries across Great Britain at the time. Now there's something like 6. And the one that you see here, it was now the newly termed Tate Modern, repurposed the power plant as the gallery for 20th century art. So the Swiss firm of Herzog and de Meuron were hired in 1995. And you can see that basically the building is as it was. It was cleaned up. They took care of spalling tuck pointing, et cetera, spalling mortar. They added a little lantern up here, and then this long sort of raised skylight, which is in keeping with the kind of severe and simple lines of the building and suits this building really, really well. So the section on the right, or sections, show you the machine hall, huge, huge open space. That is now one of the sort of great, gigantic venues for showing modern art anywhere in the world. And it's big enough that it can hold sculptures that can't be put under roof in very many places in the world otherwise. So it's been a huge success. So it can contribute to the urban cultural landscape. So it is socially sustainable. This is another way to think about that third realm of sustainability. That adaptively reused projects have a little bit of an edge over brand new structures because they already fit in the neighborhood. They already tell a story about the place where they're situated. Actually, I'm going to go ahead from this one. I'll skip over that one. We'll stay in London to wrap up here. So I wanted to make the point again that adaptive reuse can be at a whole bunch of different scales, right? It can be big fancy buildings, simpler but big industrial buildings like the Tate Modern, can be individual buildings across a whole city, and then even really tiny scale like these projects that I love so much. You're probably familiar with the red phone booths that have been popular throughout Great Britain, especially in London, for, well, decades and decades, going back to the early 20th century. But you can imagine now how many people use public phones, right? Not so much, since we all carry our phones in our pockets. So again, it's the story of this thing has gone obsolete. But these have such a strong presence, especially in London. They're like the double-decker buses. It's just kind of a ubiquitous part of London and the visual experience of this place. So no one wanted to get rid of them. So, give you a second here to think about, if you were given this challenge, how would you adaptively reuse a phone booth? There's been a lot of different approaches. There's this company called Podworks that have basically moved in a tiny, tiny office into these telephone booths. So there's an internet connection, there's a power supply if you need to charge your device, and you can close the door and be out of the noise and have an emergency meeting on the street. So that is one approach. Cash station, ATMs, we need those all over the place, right? So those have become one of the more common uses of these. These little tiny libraries, community libraries that you see in neighborhoods sometimes. This is another way that they've been adaptively reused for urban neighborhoods in London. So all of these very cute, very self-contained, right? Two more slightly ambitious projects as we wrap up. A whole coffee stand is accommodated in this one on the right. And you can see this, this guy has a refrigerator, his espresso machine, the table and the chalkboard all fold up and go into the thing at night when he goes home. Clearly he's always, he's subject to the weather, which is maybe a dangerous thing to do in London, but there it is. And then my personal favorite is what's advertised as a disco for introverts. So you go in, lock the door behind you, close the door, put a coin in a machine, and ABBA or somebody comes on, Earth, Wind, and Fire, I don't know. And you see there's a disco ball, lights go, and you can have your own little dance party, all on your onesie, inside the phone booth. So, and it's been, an incredible success actually, and has drawn a lot of people to this funny little hamlet where it's, where it is in place. So again, adaptive reuse in a broad scan of many different scales. This is just one question I wanted to come back to because I kind of think it gets to kind of the gist of some of the things that came up in questions this last week. And I know this is a concern for everybody, for every architect. You need to know these things when your client comes to you with a building that may or may not be worth preserving, because not everything is, right? So I asked you to think about, in comparison with new construction, it's easier for adaptive reuse to do what? Well, I think these are the only things that are really certain. If, again, you've already figured out that the thing you're preserving is worthy of adaptive reuse. Again, some buildings aren't worth it, either because they're falling down, they're not sound, they were non-contributing. But for those things that you think have a place in your community, they're going to continue to enhance the existing character. They manifest collective memory and heritage. They preserve historic materials that are sometimes no longer available, and that's true of craft materials as well as some early 20th century things that are really beautiful materials but aren't made anymore, sometimes because the process is toxic. And they record the skills of craftspeople who are lost. But here's the gist, right? Can they ensure that there's no construction debris being added to the stream? No. They can probably ensure that there's going to be less, but not none, right? There's going to be something. There's always something. Can they guarantee lower energy costs? They can't guarantee it. That again is something that's really worth studying. Again, historic preservation has higher standards for what you can do to an enclosure, for example, to make it more waterproof, windproof, better to keep the heat or cold on the inside, whatever your season needs to be. Adaptive reuse allows you to exchange more materials, so you could more easily have higher efficiency windows, for example. There's also the issue, though, that some structures, right, the approach of, say, masonry, bearing walls, are naturally sustainable, right? We've seen that in the vernacular section. So ultimately, you can't know for sure. This is not something that you can run through a checklist and say, yep, no, yep, no, yep, no. It's sustainable adaptive reuse. It's hard, right? There's a lot of nuances here. But so it's worth being familiar with these issues, with these arguments, with these opportunities. So when you have those clients, you can talk them through their opportunities and possibilities and then make good decisions. So this is where we're going to go into. We will take a break, give you 5-10 minutes to clear your minds a little bit, and then come back into groups. And what I'm asking you to do is kind of engage in a mini seminar. And I think for this, it's going to work best if you do have a leader in the group. So let's play the birthday game again. And whoever has the next birthday coming up, they should be the leader and kind of make sure that everybody has a chance to present and just keep the discussion going. So what I'm asking you to do, and if you go back to the narrative for the week, you'll see this is written out. If you remember when we started sustainability, there was a worksheet, and on the second page, there was a chart with the 3 realms and just asking you for like, how does architecture do this? So you've looked at that with new construction, you've looked at that with vernacular stuff, and now it's time to look at it through the lens of adaptive reuse. So I'd say, grab that sheet and keep adding on to it, or draw up a new one if you prefer. And that's really what you want to talk about in your group. So everybody should present their adaptive reuse project, and then make sure you hit on those 3 themes. And your building might not perform as great in each of them, or it might be a little bit of a mystery if you weren't able to track down quite all the information you wanted. But that's the point of the conversation, to present your project in light of those 3 realms. All right, so those 3 realms, which ultimately make your building sustainable. All right. Any major takeaways, or let me rephrase that. What are 3 main takeaways that you found through this discussion with your colleagues?
Is it safe to say that adaptive reuse is more expensive on the whole than new construction?
Is it safe to say that adaptive reuse is more expensive than new construction? What do you think?
I think it's different case by case.
For my project, it's cheaper to do that. So there's a huge concrete structure to tear down.
Okay.
So in the room, they're saying case by case and discussing a couple case studies. How about in Zoom? What do you guys think? Did you come up with any evidence or have any general observations about cost?
Yeah, I think it just depends on the case and how much, like how old something is, or how much they want to keep of that building.
Okay. There are a lot of variables, right? When I remember there was a big story way back when I was an undergrad. There's a Paul Rudolph building, pretty famous mid-century architect, on our campus that was going to be demolished. And the thing was, it was, it's pretty much like almost a single pour for this concrete building, and it leaked. It was, not detailed well or not constructed well. Somebody was at fault. So it had a lot of problems that just was full of mold, and being a concrete structure with concrete partition walls, it was really hard for it to flex into any other use at all. So to make it work for another academic building was seen as just too expensive and too difficult for what they thought they would be getting out of it. So that building was torn down. So even in that case, it was a really striking visual design by a famous architect, and the university ultimately said we just can't do it because it's too hard to deal with. So once in a while, that's going to happen. Other cases, though, not so much. And also another thing we want to think about is there's one thing to do the spreadsheet when you first get the project, and then project 50 years from now, and where are we going to be? So financing can be a very complicated issue for sure. So I know if you wanted to leave today knowing for sure what the answer was, I'm sorry, there's no right answer here. Okay, so that's one issue, economics. What else? What else came up in your discussions? Adaptive reuse and sustainability.
A lot of the, what was noticeable is one of the buildings that actually were mainly built toward sustainability were actually more modern buildings.
What do you mean by modern? The statement is buildings that were adaptively reused were more modern, more likely to be modern?
Well, yeah, more likely to be modern.
What do you mean by modern? In their style or just
Well,
time
like-
frame?
Like in just general, solar power, solar powered panels. The green building, for example,
Okay,
is a very modern building. While in my case, my building, the MECD upgrade, it was a very historical. What's the word?
yeah, the train station, right?
The train station made into a museum.
Mm-hmm.
It was more of a historical preservation and slash reuse.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't made to be sustainable. That was just an afterthought, just, make up some modern building.
You're saying the late 19th or early 20th train station was not built to be sustainable?
But when they
Or the adaptive reuse project did not take on sustainability as a,
yeah.
An advertised value.
That actually refurbished it, or was it just trying, use it for, historical preservation, was one of the main concerns. Sustainability was not really taken a lot into consideration.
well, I think that, maybe, because I can see how when you do a project on, in this case, the French, Parisian train station, Musée d'Orsay, which is turned from a train station into a museum, they weren't talking about sustainability in economic or environmental terms. Right? The idea was that this is a cultural landmark, and it was a proper setting for Impressionist art, which is most of that collection, right? So in that case, they may have been using a different language, but no matter what the language is or the promotion that we sometimes see from the developers and architects and clients, you can still read these values in the projects. So it's still valid to say, is this a sustainable thing, whether or not the, Gael Lente, the designer, talked about that. So that's an interesting point. All right, anything else? Zoom, I'm looking at you.
One of the things that our group talked about is that for the adaptive reuse, a lot of times the new use is for that social sustainability, like museums, gathering spaces, co-ops, entertainment spaces, things like that. So, I did Musée d'Orsay too. So that's one of the things we talked about was in terms of like the environment, it wasn't necessarily super like hyped on sustainability in that realm. But the social aspect is it's bringing millions of people to that building every year. So economic and social, it's hugely sustainable. And that was what our group kind of found in agreement, is that it was all really hyped around the social sustainability.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think we see that certainly in a lot of the sort of really grand historic structures that some of you looked at. Because some of you had that bookstore that's in the Gothic church in the Netherlands, yeah? And that's a crazy project, right? And I think that's just endlessly fascinating to me, in part because it's this amazing architecture that the community wanted to save for the value of the architecture and what it did physically for the neighborhood. It had become a very secularized place. There was no need to save that church for its function. And we see that a lot happening in, city centers right here in Nashville, right? As congregations shrink in city centers and move out to suburbs, you have to figure out what to do with those old church buildings. And oftentimes you find that sustainable social aspect comes out of the community that will be directly impacted by the demolition of a building. So in the case of, a big museum in Paris, it's at a whole different scale. But it is another indicator of how buildings are valued and preserved and adaptively reused for what they contribute to an environment. So lots of different, I appreciate the conversation here, which has touched on a lot of diverse ideas. I don't know how many of the groups got into Goldberger, but when you get to the journaling question today, it specifically touches on that, because this is one of those weeks that Why Architecture Matters really does relate very much to the content we're looking at here. And in particular, what I want to draw your attention to is his talk about nothing being timeless. Like there's no architecture that rises above the time in which it was made. It might need to change in terms of its function, like it's obsolete, but there's something characteristic about the style, a method of building. And he uses this term zeitgeist. If you come across that in other classes, either history, literature, sometimes it comes around. Zeitgeist is a German word that that literally means time ghost or time spirit. We usually translate that as the spirits of the age. And it's a concept that early 20th century modernist architects use, and artists, some writers also, to explain how, or to argue for, the idea that the architecture we design in our present day absolutely must look different from what we've seen in the past. That the visual associations that we see in historic architecture are no longer relevant because we are so inherently more modern than everyone who has come before us. Excuse me. So that is a modernist point of view, and what Goldberger is trying to describe to you is that he thinks there is a time stamp on architecture. And I'd like for you to think about this in terms of your adaptive reuse projects, because so often there is a really intentional difference between sort of the new intervention and the old shell of the thing. But what he's trying to argue is that it's not so much because architects are beholden to the spirit, an answer to a spirit, but rather that they're serving new functions, they have new technologies at their disposal. But the fact that you preserve that old thing shows that we in this time frame value that old stuff. So as you go through his discussion of how buildings represent their time, keep that in mind, because there's a lot of competing points of view on that matter. And you, I'm certain, will develop your own approach to the responsibility you feel to embed, adopt new materials and resources and structure versus maintaining older traditions. This has kind of been a theme that's been sneaking up on us through the whole semester. I've asked you to think about vernacular prototypes that go back thousands of years and say, you can keep doing, what those folks were doing, those non-architects, those builders, right? There's things to learn from. So that's my point of view. You will develop your own, I'm sure. So, again, so the journal question is going to ask specifically about Goldberger. So if you want to take a little time to muse on that, please feel free. I'd like to review those by Friday, so hopefully you have them done by then. So, any other questions or comments on this subject before we wrap things up here this evening? Okay, I just wanted to go through a few notes to make sure everyone is on the same page here. That three realms chart, while this conversation is fresh in your mind, I encourage you to go get that thing in shape, because it will be the foundation for one of the last exercises for the class. So you should have run through that chart for vernacular stuff, for sustainability last week, and now for adaptive reuse. So there should be a lot of information embedded in that chart. Your next step to wrap up the adaptive reuse project is if you go back to that first chart where you put your name in and you lodged your link, you'll see that I've asked you to review another person's project in the class. So I'm asking you to download that rubric and do the project assessment for someone in the class. And this is done so they get your feedback, but then also it's a good exercise for all of us once in a while to look really carefully at the work that someone else has done for a project we've completed also. And most of the people in the class, you'll be looking at a project that's on your same building. So I think it'll be illustrative for you to see how someone else handled the same material. I will let you know that I'm thinking about this next week as a time for you to start staging yourself for the end of the semester. There's going to be a number of readings to complete, and some of them are kind of heavy because they get into some racial issues. But the only assignment that you'll need to do for the class in preparation for next week, in addition to reading and watching some videos, is to take part in a discussion board. So that's the only thing that'll be due. All right.